Pardon the interruption, I'm Chris Gehrz. Sam, your kids are both away at camp this week. Is anything going to change at the Mulberry house?
Chris, 3 words. Candy for breakfast. Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry. Chris, we're back for another webisode. This past week, in the last webisode, we had students write about the Benedict option. I was pretty excited to read the responses, especially how long the responses were and how interactive they were. I mean, this is what we kind of hope for with that. What is your reaction to some of the things you read?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just appreciate students took seriously some of what we had tweaked about the assignment from the Unit 1 version to Unit 2 of, the length, the thoughtfulness. Actually, I thought it was pretty good in the first one, but that they were responding to each other. Not everyone did this, but the best ones were taking up specific points from someone else in the thread, or even kind of responding across threads and trying. I just thought. To show our cards, we actually used the Benedict option as an inspiration for an essay we did the face-to-face course in fall and spring, and I actually thought there was much more thoughtful.
Don't tell the other students, but you guys were better.
Well, I thought they, partly because that comes at the end of the semester, people are getting busy. This was in the middle of the term. I think you all took it really seriously. You were thoughtful. It was, clearly I think there was a lot of criticism of it, but there were some strong arguments made in favor of it. I really appreciated it. I kind of expected that. I was surprised in the first couple of assignments, especially that, we called it the Godwin response, but one of the questions in that first response in Unit 2 asked about a medieval habitation you were drawn to, and I think half my students wrote about Benedictine monasticism. So I was really curious to see what they would do with the kind of contemporary version of that. And honestly, there's so much fuzziness about what this would mean in practice. Any response could conceivably make sense, and that's why we put that kind of yes but.
Right. I think it's actually a great model of why you take a class like this. Is we last webisode, Amy and I talked about the question of kind of what can contemporary Christians learn from medievals, but this is an example of sort of saying. Yep. Yeah, there's real stuff we can think about there. So.
Yeah, and beyond the Benedict idea, it also is forcing us to think about historical, if not analogies, parallels to what does the collapse of a civilization look like? Are we actually going through that? And maybe you come away from that saying, we're overstating things. Things in America, I had some students want to say, things in America are actually not nearly as bad as 5th century Roman Empire in Western Europe. And others thinking, there are things really fundamentally pulling us apart, structures are falling apart. And so I think it's a really useful question to think about. I especially appreciate it. I had 1 or 2 students kind of think about, well, if you don't like the Benedict option, what would another option be? So I had a student write about Francis of Assisi as a different kind of monastic sort of habitation. That's probably a good question to keep in the back of your minds. If the major goal of the course is to help you think about how Christians relate to culture and why these 2,000 years of history might inform that, you might think about what would your option be. That was actually the synthesizing essay students wrote about, and we might have a version of that question as we get to the end of the semester. Okay, Sam, one of the things we talked about in the second half of Unit 2 is the Renaissance. So students had mostly an art museum to visit, and they encountered people like Erasmus and Machiavelli. Now, I have to admit, as you know from doing a previous podcast, I really dislike the Renaissance. I'm not a huge fan of the art of the period. I don't especially resonate with... I like Erasmus a lot, I'll say that. I don't resonate especially. Help me overcome my irrational dislike of the Renaissance. You'll make the case more in a moment.
Sure.
Here. Make the case for the Renaissance to me.
Well, I think part of it is, Chris, what field of study are you in?
I'm a historian.
Well, these are people who are interested in the past to a certain degree. Now not all of the past. There's certain parts of the past.
That's true.
But I think there is this sense of wanting to recapture the past, because they could take a mindset, as we're going to see people generations later, to say, progress comes, our civilization getting better comes from eschewing the past and looking forward.
Nice to use the word eschew. I think that's the first in our episodes.
All right. But people of the Renaissance actually say, there actually was something we want to mine from the past. Now, you might not like the fact that they dismiss the Middle Ages, which they do, but I think you should at least find something of a sort of kindred spirits there. I also think I think there are elements. I mean, there are lots of. I partially want to point out the things you don't like about it, which is a very elitist movement. I mean, the people enjoying the Renaissance are the wealthy elites who can enjoy the Renaissance, who can read and write. Who have
that is true of many movements we talk about.
Right. But I think it actually is. It's one of those interesting turning point moments where there is some quantum leaps, in terms of, I mean, in art especially. I think that's because it's literally very visual. You can see. I mean, if you look at medieval art versus Renaissance art, as students did in the museum, you can see like something amazing has happened, right? And it's the kind of thing to dig into. Plus, there's elements of the Renaissance, as much as they are looking backwards, that are also building the groundwork, the foundations for the modern world as well. I mean, I think it's hard to imagine some elements of the Reformation, some elements of the scientific revolution without this period of the Renaissance. I think it's really significant in that way.
Okay, I'm persuaded.
Yes. All right.
I'm mildly persuaded.
All right.
We'll come back to it.
So we're going to talk about a couple different readings from this unit. We have two major Luther readings. You're a big fan of Luther's On Secular Authority, so make the case for why this is a really significant reading.
Sure, and I'm a big fan, not in the sense that I think he's right in every single respect. I'm a big fan in the sense that it's a really complicated reading that rewards close attention and thought, and that might actually, you could imagine a Luther option, for example, coming out of this. And I think it's a nice corrective to some pretty, I think, less thoughtful ways of thinking about culturally. I mean, Luther would have us really question the idea that there can be such a thing as a Christendom, in the Middle Ages parlance, or even, honestly, a common American idea of, this is an exceptional Christian nation that plays a special role in God's providential plans for the world. I mean, Luther would, I think, scoff at that and suggest that, no, I mean, political institutions serve the interests of the kingdom of the world, and those are not unimportant interests. I mean, like Augustine, he would say that the earthly good has its uses in this world, right? We do want that temporary, flawed peace because it's better than just violence everywhere, right? But that's not the same thing as advancing the kingdom of God, and there are different callings here. I also, though, think you can think about, well, how is this planting the seeds for some dangerous ideas later on? So I mostly do 20th century European history, and as I study the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism, as I study the origins of the Holocaust, it's very clear that Luther's two kingdoms idea, taken in a certain direction by German Protestants, makes them very leery of criticizing political institutions. There's almost this sense of, well, the church speaks to religious issues, the government speaks to political issues, and so the German church, I think to its lasting shame, fails to speak up for those on the margins of German society in the 30s and 40s, with some exceptions. But I think that's the danger of what Luther is saying, is it might tempt us to think we ought to retreat from politics, have nothing to say about injustice in this world. So, Sam, I like secular authority. I also like the other reading, but I think you especially enjoy Preface to Romans, which, I've taught a Reformation history class. There's some kind of more famous readings we use, like Freedom of a Christian is one of Luther's great works in 1520. Why do we focus attention on the preface to the Epistle to the Romans?
I love Preface to Romans for a number of reasons. Luther's a Bible scholar, so we get to see him doing biblical scholarship here to a certain degree. I mean, he's writing a preface to say, hey, you should go read, it's a little scriptura, right? You should go read Romans. Before you do, let me prepare you for that. So I think that's interesting. We're seeing him do that. In this course, we talk a lot about significance. And I feel like this is one where the significance just drips off it in terms of how do we understand the significance of Luther and what is Luther doing differently with theology. And he's laying out a program for that here. And it's a program of saying, okay, as you read Preface to Romans, here's the language that Paul uses. Here's how it's been misunderstood. And he lays out pretty clearly. So when I teach this in face-to-face CWC, I often have students we build a chart together of these different words that Luther's talking about. Law, sin, faith, grace, righteousness. And then we say, okay, how does Luther say medievals thought about this, or how is this being misunderstood? And then how is Luther redefining that term? And if you look at that chart, you have two different ways to read Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, we never have time for this in class, but what I always tell them is when the semester's over and you have a little time, you should read Romans twice. Read it once with those medieval definitions, or as Luther says, the medieval definitions, and then read it with Luther's new definitions, and you will see what the theological revolution of Luther is. I mean, it's laid out there. The understanding of grace and the understanding of salvation is fundamentally different with that. So to me, it's like, oh, why is he important? he is being significant in the moment of laying out that program. Now, he blows those ideas out and works them out in other places and in other readings. But to me, that one it's very clear, it's very succinct what he's up to. Now, it also has further significance as I'm a big fan of John Wesley, and John Wesley has his kind of pietistic conversion experience upon hearing someone read this and having this
not Romans, but the preface.
Right, reading preface to Romans. Yeah. And what he talks about is this sort of, his heart is strangely warmed, and there's a kind of certainty in his heart after that. And I think that actually, he's resonating with the best of what Luther's hoping is going to happen there. So I think that's actually just a really cool moment. Yep. Chris, I sort of mentioned Pietism really quickly there. Maybe we can have a moment to kind of...
Can I make the pitch for this?
Yes, give you the ball and run with it.
So, you encountered this briefly if you got to one of the last rooms in the Reformation Museum. We kind of tucked a little section on Pietism around the corner from Wars of Religion, because historically it comes much later. It's coming, over a century after Luther's death, after the Reformation. And I think it's picking up on a couple of tensions left over from the Reformation. So you mentioned that you could read Romans, kind of as a medieval scholastic theologian as Luther. I would also suggest read Loyola, especially where the places he talks about predestination, Protestant understandings of grace, and then go back and read Romans. Wonder now, wait a minute, are good works supposed to result? Is Christianity just about, you're justified, is this kind of like God gives this to you, but it doesn't change your life at all? Luther ends up thinking eventually that the best we can hope for is that Christians are simultaneously sinners and saints. And they're saints not really because of what they've done, but because God imputes righteousness to them. But if you read the early Luther, Preface to Romans says that faith is this busy, powerful, active thing that can't do anything but good. And I think this kind of gets lost in these debates where Catholics become the good works people and Lutherans become it's justification by faith alone through grace alone. Pietists want to recover that as Lutherans and say, well, yeah, that's true. We are not justified by our own works, but Christianity is not just about believing that. You're not a Christian if you can sign on to the Augsburg Confession. Christianity is about experience and activity and encounters with God and worship and devotion, and that probably is actually more important than intellectual belief, and they worry about what they call dead orthodoxy. And I think that's a good word to... I'm actually writing a book right now what this would look like in the 21st century, and it's easy to see kind of dead orthodoxies, liberal, conservative, where they really get caught up arguing about theological distinctions and doctrinal differences, and maybe we kind of lose sight of it's a lived faith. It's supposed to reshape the world, and it brings renewal of individuals and of churches and of societies. The second thing, obviously a big theme in this unit, and you saw it in the last film about Erasmus's concern that the cure might be worse than the disease. I'm a Protestant. I tend to think Luther was right. I think there is undeniably corruption that needs to be addressed. I do lament the division of the church. And the other thing Pietism is contributing is a sense that maybe as Protestants we get too concerned about saying, here I stand, I can do no other, and that means I'm going to go my own direction. It's how we end up with all these different denominations and schisms and splits. We experience this. I have at least 3 congregations, denominations do this, families experience this. And Pietism, right from the very beginning, wants to say maybe we ought to revalue unity and find ways to live together. And not to say we won't split, but maybe we're a little too quick to do that. And maybe we ought to cluster together around the shared work that we have to do, the shared experiences we have of worship, or here a place like Bethel of study. So that's my case for Pietism. I could say a lot more, but we're going to run out of time. Anything you want to add, Sam?
I'm not convinced.
All right.
Well, welcome to segment 2. We're going to play our second game of Food Chain. Amy, last week you played Chris and Make the Case and kind of crushed him, so you're 1-0 right now.
Thank you, fans. I was pretty excited about that.
That makes Chris 1-1-1, and I am 0-1-1.
Okay,
so I need to up my game at this point. So what we're doing for Food Chain is the most significant figures of Unit 2. So I'm going to go first.
Okay.
What do you got? My number 5 figure is John Calvin.
All right.
So I'm putting Calvin up here. I realized as I looked at my list, it's kind of heavy on the Reformation, but I think Calvin's a really significant, important figure, especially in terms of shaping Protestant theology. I'm going to have another Protestant up here who's historically very significant, but I think that Calvin's role in taking up the Reformation that Luther starts and really trying to create a more systematic theology is something that sustains the Reformation a great deal. So that's why I have Calvin on this list. I think he's really important for shaping the Reformation. Number 4 on my list is one of my favorite people we study in this course, and that is Erasmus.
Aha.
Erasmus is great because he's sort of a 2-for-1, because you get a Renaissance figure. I love that Erasmus reading in terms of encouraging Christians to look to pagan sources to help them understand the Bible better. And he's also a significant reform figure. He's calling for a lot of the same things that Luther is in terms of fixing corruption in the church. But he has this split with Luther on salvation, but most importantly, the split is on whether or not to divide the church in the name of reform. And I think Erasmus is a name which in lots of ways has been lost to kind of your general Western Civ course. I'm assuming a lot of Western Civ classes, you kind of need to wrestle with Luther a little bit, but someone like Erasmus probably doesn't get mentioned. And I think he's an unbelievably significant figure. One of my favorite moments is there's a letter that Melanchthon writes to, Philip Melanchthon, who's one of Luther's kind of lieutenants, writes to Erasmus trying to convince him to join the Protestant Reformation, which just points to how significant of a voice Erasmus was in the 16th century. So I'm a huge, huge fan of Erasmus. Number 3 is
Aquinas again.
Thomas Aquinas. I mean, he is the leading intellectual light of the Middle Ages. He is kind of the epitome of the medieval mind, the pinnacle of medieval synthesis. And he's also a really significant figure going forward in terms of shaping what's going to be the Roman Catholic Church. So if we're going to have all these Protestants up here, I also want to have Aquinas up here, both as a medieval figure, but as a really significant theologian for shaping what the Catholic Church is going to look like going forward, and some of its big differences from the Protestant Church. Number 2 is Francis of Assisi. I think Francis is unbelievably important. If you were to think about sort of who the biggest hero of the Middle Ages was to medieval people, Francis is going to be that person. He is sort of a picture of kind of the ideal medieval saint. He takes a medieval institution like Benedictine monasticism and reforms it to try to get back to the core of what Benedict was after, what Benedict was trying to do. So I think Francis is unbelievably important. We spent a lot of time with him in this course. So he's somebody that I think, as we're looking at this unit, that I wanted to have really high on my list. And my number 1 person is Martin Luther. We've talked a lot about Luther in this course, but I think the significance of the Protestant Reformation for shaping Christianity, having this big divide between Protestants and Catholics, new ways to read the Bible, new focus on Scripture, just a total reformation of Christianity is really important. But he's also important because elements of what Luther does helps to dramatically shape the modern world. Now, Luther's very much not a modern person. We'll see this when we get into Unit 2 or Unit 3, but Luther is unbelievably significant for laying some of the groundwork for that modern world. So that's my top 5. I'm going to turn it over to you, Amy.
All right, well, this is going to be kind of tough because we're going to see quite a bit of overlap in the list that I'm going to create. Also, what you can't really tell is that behind the scenes, I do not ever really like to disagree with Professor Mulberry. I'm totally fine arguing against Professor Gehrz, but I tend to agree with Professor Mulberry, who's a dear friend of mine. So this is going to be a little bit tricky, but I'm going to take a slightly different direction with it. So I'm going to start with Francis of Assisi down here. So in some ways, I'm just going to kind of point to some of the things that Professor Mulberry has already said and argued. But again, I think Francis offers us this continuation of models of monasticism that really sort of meet the needs of the culture at the particular time. So Francis isn't somebody who is a critic of, say, the way that Benedict has organized monasticism within the 6th and then into the 7th and 8th centuries, but rather Francis is saying times are different, that we do live in a more stable society, we do have more security, and so we need to sort of move beyond the walls of the monastery and bring what the monastery has to offer to where people are hurting. And so Francis offers us this model of saying, how do you live out what the scriptures call you to do when it says, what does it really mean to be Christ's hands and feet? And so even though today we know that this model of monasticism still exists, even if you aren't living this particular way, Francis really serves as this model of saying, how do you, again, not critiquing what has been the model in the past, say, what is the right response for right now? And how do you truly take up Christ's cross and follow him, having basically given up everything, given up all of your worldly possessions, really only carrying the clothes on your back. And so this amazing model for us that really speaks to a time in the church where we see people truly living out their faith through their daily actions in every single respect. Kind of building on that, the second person that I'm going to choose here is Teresa of Avila. And so the reason that I've chosen Teresa is because she's become one of the most interesting figures that I have really been, I think, shaped by, formed by in my teaching of CWC, the more that I have learned about her. But this very important saint of the church who, living in the 16th and then into the 17th century, is living through the effects of this Protestant Reformation. Teresa remains committed to what will become the Catholic Church, and she serves as this model of the fact that women continue to play a very important role in Catholicism and in the tradition of the church. And so Teresa becomes a member of the Barefoot Carmelites, which is another monastic movement for women, and this idea of barefoot, that literally you don't even need shoes, that what you need, God will provide for you. Teresa has visions. She is a prolific writer, and she writes about these incredible, very personal encounters with God, and I think that that's significant because I do think sometimes if you aren't particularly familiar with Catholicism, you tend to sort of dismiss orthoprax traditions as being too much focused on works, and they aren't really personal, and they don't have a personal engagement, and that is certainly not the case, and we see that with Teresa. She wasn't afraid to engage the big questions and the challenges of the day. She even writes that if she were given the opportunity, one of her favorite things she would want to do would be able to debate Martin Luther. So I just think that's such a fascinating thing and kind of shows her bravery and the fact that, like, a woman could write these things, could make these statements, and she isn't punished for that, but she's respected as an important member of the church. And so really the central idea here is that Protestantism really will not have an active role for women for centuries. Luther is very outspoken about the role of women. Calvin isn't particularly embracing of women in terms of what their role can be within the church structure. So this is something that there's a place for women within this existing tradition that isn't really going to be replicated in Protestantism. In some cases, not even, in certain traditions, not even today. The next person I'm going to put up here, and I think let's focus on this as potentially a glaring error with Professor Mulberry's list is like, well, this is pretty Reformation heavy. So by the end of this, you're going to be pretty sick of the sauce, I'm thinking. And so I'm going to add a little bit more meat to the dish, and we are going to, I'm going to add Michelangelo here, who is this amazing sculptor and artist, of the Renaissance time period. When we look at his art, what it is able to speak to us in terms of this idea of going back to the sources, the spirit of ad fontes, of looking back to that which has come before. When we look at the themes of biblical history that are at work within Michelangelo's art, this idea that thinking about the Platonic forms, and I think of how for some students who struggle to understand Plato and Plato's theories when they're learning them in the first unit, this is kind of where it comes together. It's this amazing example to say, okay, now do you get it? Like, do you understand what we're talking about when we're talking about, say, an Aristotelian view versus a Platonic view? And so these amazing pieces of art that are left for us to help us both understand this time period, but that which came before, and also to understand ideas about how people were viewing the human spirit. As Professor Gehrz said, these are kind of elitist movements. Not everybody is engaging in this, but these works that he created have stood the test of time. We think of his works in the Sistine Chapel and this fusion, again, between sort of the secular and the sacred, and how interesting that is for us. I would be remiss if I did not put Muhammad on my list, and this is not just because I spend most of my time dealing with Islamic studies, but this is because Muhammad becomes the prophet for what will become the second largest religion in the world, the fastest growing religion in the world, which is Islam. So Islam, as one of the three Abrahamic traditions, tying itself to this idea of monotheism, and what Muhammad sort of starts, continues. It continues forward. The important contributions that happen to science and art. We know that Islam can be quite controversial today. Even in the headlines this week, we know that there's a lot of confusion surrounding it. And so I think that it would be impossible to ignore Islam if we wanted to not only understand today's history. We can't really start with today. We can't start a study of Islam today in the modern moment. We have to be able to go back to the 7th century and to this time period where Muhammad becomes the prophet of Islam, today a global religion, where the vast majority, as I've said to you before, don't live in, quote, the Arab world, but rather live all around. And it's something that we need to know about, and it's significant. It's not obscure. It's not random. It's important for all of us, no matter who or what we're studying. And then finally here, I am going to kind of parallel the importance of the Protestant Reformation with the figure of Erasmus. And I want you to think of everything that Professor Mulberry said about why Erasmus is important. And I want to emphasize and agree with everything that he said. I guess the point that I want to make here is what for me puts Erasmus over the top as opposed to choosing Luther is the fact that we would have no Luther if we did not have Erasmus. That there's this common phrase that Luther hatches the egg that Erasmus lays. The ideas that Luther espouses as being central to the reform that's needed within the church, they come from Erasmus. Erasmus's approach to knowledge, which many of you wrote about in your responses this week, and how that really resonated with you, that Erasmus, again, not afraid of culture, but yet having a relationship with it where you are always challenging it, that you are always using it to help you sharpen your understanding of your own faith. But the main reason that I sort of elevate Erasmus over Luther is because I do think that Erasmus was having the long view. He agreed with the need for reform in the moment, but at the same time, I think Erasmus demonstrated through his writings and through his opposition to Luther, not an opposition with the reforms that Luther was calling for, but rather an awareness of how does this impact people? So you break apart this system that affects everybody, right, in the culture. What is going to happen when you take that apart? And we know that there are people, this is what your life is centered around, so to break down that structure and to cause people to question it is definitely going to leave many people who are already marginalized even in an even more precarious position.
Well, I'm actually a big fan of your list, and it definitely points to things that are missing on mine. I think to not have a Protestant on here is a little weird.
Okay.
But I think you have a couple on here that I think are really, really significant. Michelangelo and especially Muhammad. I mean, when we're talking about significance, he's unbelievably significant to the world we live in today and the world he lived in every year since he was alive. Yeah. So I think what this points to is that Unit 2 covers a pretty wide swath.
Definitely.
And it depends on what you're focusing on.
And it doesn't happen in a vacuum, that there's this impact that extends beyond the actual geographic area that we're talking about now.
Exactly. So students, take a look at these lists. Go on to Moodle and vote who you think had the better list. Let us know who you think we're missing.
Yeah, who's missing? We had other options to choose from. We've got to narrow it down and take our argument one direction.
Where's Gutenberg?
Yeah, where is Gutenberg? Where's Hildegard? Could I have just as easily put Hildegard here as Teresa? Did I make the wrong choice? What about some of the other Protestants that we could have put here? So.
All right, we'll be right back.
It's happy time. Happy 40th birthday to Sherlock himself, Benedict Cumberbatch. I just watched this again last night.
Did you? Wow.
Amy, I think it's fair to say that Benedict Cumberbatch has one of the most amazing names in popular culture. Which member of the CWC Cloud of Witnesses do you think has the best name?
That is a tough one, Chris. Mm-hmm. You might think to yourself, students, it must be Menno Simons, but that's only because you have not yet gotten to Blaise Pascal.
Oh, that's right.
So I'm going to go with Blaise Pascal, who you will encounter in the 3rd unit. I think that it's going to make a comeback as the most popular baby boy name in the United States. If I had a 3rd son, I think I would probably name him Blaise. It sounds like a superhero. It sounds like a hip hop artist. It sounds like a politician. Any way that you want to go, you're always
defensive back.
You're always going to win with Blaise Pascal.
The future is wide open.
It is. It is wide open. Well, okay. Sorry. Happy anniversary to Chris and his wife, Katie, who celebrate the big number 10 this week. That's right. Any plans, Chris?
Ordinarily, our tradition the last few years has been to go to the Guthrie. They do a summer musical. Yeah. We did My Fair Lady last year, 2 years ago. I think we did Music Man last year, which my wife is from Iowa. She loved it. South Pacific this year. Yep. I've never actually seen it. I've heard great things about it. I could not convince my better half to go along, and so instead we're going out to supper. Which is not, that by itself a really momentous thing. I will be giving her a nice gift that she doesn't know about. So this is also a test to see if my wife happens to watch this YouTube channel. I'll say the nice gift is that we're actually uprooting and moving to my parents' cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia at the end of August, and we promised that we're going to take a nice weekend to ourselves. So
nice.
It'll be a delayed 10th anniversary celebration.
Wow.
Okay, Amy.
Happy anniversary, Katie and Chris. And I love South Pacific, so the book too.
We could go.
James Mission. We could go. We're good buddies.
Right. Okay. That'd be fine. Happy trails to the Republican Veep Stakes. Donald Trump last week named Indiana Governor Mike Pence his running mate. Amy, do you want to break down the Democratic Veep Stakes for us?
This is a tough one. There was a point in time just about 3 days ago where everyone you see here behind me was actually in contention to be Hillary Clinton's. Yes, including Dan Ritchie. Okay. Yes. And as you might note, Hillary Clinton herself, first candidate to run as both president.
I don't think the Constitution bars that.
I don't think it does. So, yeah, no, this has been a tough one. I mean, this has been all over the news trying to figure this out. Literally, I read a couple articles this morning where we had here are the top 8 people, here are the top 5 people, here are the top 3 people.
Wait, you did research for this?
I did. I come into every segment having done my research. Once again, I thought we'd have this amazing conversation about South Pacific, but that went nowhere. What was that fancy word that Sam used?
Eschew.
Gesundheit. So anyway, I think that the 3 main choices right now are going to be Tim Kaine from Virginia. So this is somebody that's going to appeal to sort of a
state.
Yes, a different part of the Democratic Party than Hillary Clinton has. So reach out a little bit to those who maybe she would not be their top choice as the main candidate, but Tim Kaine will help to bring them in. We've heard a lot of chatter about Elizabeth Warren, but I think that's a risky pick. I think Elizabeth Warren tends to be a little bit isolating to a lot of Americans. So I think that that's necessarily not going to help Hillary out, although that obviously would be a very interesting ticket, as we would have our first full female ticket in presidential history. And another really interesting pick, especially to Professor Mulberry, because we just talked about it before this, is Tom Perez, U.S. Labor Secretary. So
wow.
I think that's another interesting one. So, but I'm thinking, I mean, I don't know. It seems like Tim Kaine is going to be like the safe, wise choice. But I think Tom Perez would also be an interesting choice.
You heard it here first.
You did. We'll see how this goes. Or Dan Ritchie.
We'll come back to it.
There he is.
Okay.
Or Ryan Lochte, because he's not going to the Olympics.
That's right.
Did you hear that? He's not going, so he needs something to do now.
All right, Amy, before we go, any last minute advice? You talked about this with Sam on the previous webisode, but before students take tomorrow's test, any last words you want to...
I think, again, I just want to reiterate the things that we did discuss. Really don't spend too much time on that objective. Don't be afraid of starting with the essay first. That's not a bad move when it comes to this type of testing. So make sure you've got plenty of time for that. Then move on to the objectives. So just really, I know it doesn't seem like 75 minutes is a long time, but it is enough. We know it is. So kind of trust that. Know that you are going to have just even more comfortability with the fact that you've already been through this. It's going to be the same length. It's going to be, it's going to feel very familiar to you. So really just, I think, focus on that essay. If not first, then at least really maybe even try to think of leaving yourself double the time if you felt like it was something that you struggled with before.
Yeah, I would just add a reminder that the mastery vocab from Unit 1 does carry over to Unit 2. So if you look at your study guide, that you're going to see all those terms. I don't think that's going to take a lot of time. You already did studying for that just 2 weeks ago. I think it's just a refresher. But those might show up, in a matching section. They might be important parts of a connection or even of an essay as well. So I think it's just good to kind of remind yourself of who those figures were, what those events were, and maybe even start thinking about how might they connect. Like Augustine and Luther is one we probably talked about in the museum, that Luther is reviving some Augustinian theology concepts. Benedict is a different kind of monasticism than Anthony.
Right.
You see some of those connections. So otherwise, I think people basically did well, in the first test. So I don't want to cause a lot of anxiety. Just a couple of last words about time management, how you construct an essay, and
I think we've seen writing really improve with the responses that you've had to write since. So just keep that in mind. I mean, you have improved. You are better. Remember, details matter. Don't make strong statements without explaining them. So don't kind of come into this solid conclusion, but then you don't really offer why you think that. So yeah.
Okay, so that's our webisode for today. Get a good night's rest. Hopefully you do well on the tests tomorrow. And otherwise, I think that's all we have.
We'll see you next time.
So kids, put away the iPads. We're done.